In the text we are reading from the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo has been describing the human evolution, mental evolution, and now the emergence of the spiritual man out of the mental man. Nature developing broadly 4 lines in which to awaken in humanity the deeper spiritual sense. He describes each of these 4 lines now in turn, beginning with religion. And we have seen the problem of religion and how religion had abrogated to itself a greater claim, a greater power than it was worthy of, premature. And he described in the last paragraph that we read the much more plastic and free development of the religious seeking in the Indian subcontinent, where many different formulations, disciplines, cults were allowed and even encouraged to exist side by side. And this allowed for a very free, fluid development, giving space even for each individual to follow their natural inclination. He describes how, as a first step, religion's real business, he says, is to prepare man's mind, life, and bodily existence for the spiritual consciousness to take it up. But once it has made that initial preparation, it has to set aside its own need and allow the truth which has been touched to lead the further development. Meanwhile, it has to take up as much as possible of the human mind, vital and physical, to turn it in a spiritual direction. The problem, though, which we saw last time, he describes, is that in the very act of us trying to lift something from a lower grade to a higher grade, the attempt itself is corrupted by the lower material. If you reach out to a humanity which is not yet sufficiently mentalized, which is still living in a vital intuition or a physical life, and give to it an upward turn to prepare it for a later mental and even spiritual life, it will take your attempt and warp it to fit to its primary needs. And here you see most of the distortions in religion, and he describes the problem there, that truth and error are always together in human evolution. And if you try to cut out too sharply a truth, if you try to cut out too sharply an error, you end up cutting out also some aspect of the truth, of which it is a symbol or a disguise or a corruption or malformation. And he uses this phrase, resulting in surgical harm inflicted on the body of religion. We touched upon this idea, and I wanted to draw upon a text from Sri Aurobindo's Foundations of Indian Culture, where he develops in a slightly different context the full sense of what this means. I will read from the chapter titled Indian Polity Part 2. Here he says, a people, a great human collectivity, is in fact an organic living being with a collective, or rather a common or communal soul, mind and life. And when he uses this word common or communal soul, he says, for the word collective is too mechanical or to be true to the inner reality. So there's something here he is pointing to, a common communal soul, mind and body, for which the word collective is not good enough, but which is an organic living being. And we have to pause to consider what that means. Any human collectivity, and especially a great human collectivity, has this character. This would apply equally to small family units, village units, clan units, or other collectives all the way to the national identity. And of this being, which is now a living being with a communal soul, mind, and body, he says, the life of the society, like the physical life of the individual being, passes through a cycle of birth, growth, youth, ripeness, and decline. And if this last stage goes far enough without any arrest of its course towards decadence, it may perish. Even so, all the older peoples and nations except India and China perished as a man dies of old age. He is making a direct parallel between a collective's growth phase and an individual human body's growth phase. There is a birth. And just as an individual is born, a people can be born, that is, a collective identity can be born. It has its growth phase, which is often the most interesting, the most fertile and rich. And then there is the youth. It has grown and acquired a body, but it's full of vitality to do what it wants to do. And after the youth phase has exhausted much of its freshness, there is the ripeness. So in the youth, there is also a tendency for bluster, for exaggeration, for overdoing in its enthusiasm, which when it weakens sufficiently, you have the ripeness and maturity. But with maturity, you have also a greater depth, wideness, and at the same time a loss of vitality, which prepares it for the phase of decline. Unlike a human being who after the decline must end in death because we are too rigid to be able to regenerate ourselves, a collective has that fluidity. While the individuals may decline and die, the collective can regenerate itself because it's always replacing its individuals with new ones. We see this tendency not only in great civilizations, but equally in collectives which are religious or cultural, or even collectives which we would call, let's say, the scientific collective or the artistic collective, which may involve sometimes a great house that represents a line of artistic development. So Sri Aurobindo looks at this in a very general way, although he's applying it to the context of polity. The truth he describes has applications across all collectives. He continues, but the collective being has too the capacity of renewing itself, of a recovery and a new cycle. For in each people there is a soul idea or life idea at work, less mortal than its body. And if this idea is itself sufficiently powerful, large and force-giving, and the people sufficiently strong, vital and plastic in mind and temperament, to combine stability with the constant enlargement or new application of the power of the soul idea or life idea in its being, it may pass through many such cycles before it comes to a final exhaustion. So here in a complex sentence, he gives you the secret of how a collective can regenerate itself and perhaps even live in permanence. There are two kinds of inspiration which inspire it. First, he says, soul idea or life idea at work. A life idea is what you will see very often in artistic traditions or lineages. So you may look at a particular school of art or music, and the primary driver is this joy of life that particular form of art expresses. And that is the life idea which presides over it. And it can continue for quite a long time, regenerate, break into smaller groups, sometimes recombine, merge with other groups to create some variations. But the prime driver is a seed which is primarily a drive of life. There can be equally a soul idea, which is something much more essential, which would tend towards a spiritual character. And this is not so obviously in the artistic worlds, but it may be seen sometimes in philosophical worlds or in religious forms. There, the seed may have a spiritual core. Looking at the various religions of the world, Sri Aurobindo points out what is special in each of these and what's possible if they could come together. And I'm reading from the little booklet called Thoughts and Glimpses, where he says, each religion has helped mankind. Paganism increased in man the light of beauty, the largeness and height of his life, his aim at a many-sided perfection. This is one soul idea which inspires that whole line. Christianity gave him some vision of divine love and charity. And you see again the soul idea behind the religion. Buddhism has shown him a noble way to a wiser, gentler, purer. A noble way to be wiser, gentler, purer. Again, the seed idea there. Judaism and Islam, how to be religiously faithful in action and zealously devoted to God. And you can see in the very formulation, he catches the very core, essential soul idea behind, which justifies the religion and all the religion's forms and even its distortions. This zeal of devotion to God, this religious faithfulness in action, you can see how it can be easily exaggerated or warped. And yet that is what characterizes these two great traditions. Hinduism has opened to him the largest and profoundest spiritual possibilities. A great thing would be done if all these God visions could embrace and cast themselves into each other. But intellectual dogma and cult egoism stand in the way. He describes each of these as God visions. That is, behind each of these great traditions, you have a vision of God. In French, he sometimes uses that phrase. Sri Aurobindo uses the word aperçu, which is closer to the Sanskrit term darshana. You have a vision of God, and what you see in that vision, the aspect that you see, inspires now a whole movement to realize that or to express that. And the English word God vision is a bit weak. It doesn't catch the full sense of how great this is. But this here we catch some sense of what could be a soul idea as distinct from a life idea. So, if this idea, he says, is sufficiently powerful, large, and force-giving, this is the origin of the inspiration itself. On the other side, the receptive base in humanity must have the requirement that the people sufficiently strong, vital, and plastic in mind and temperament. Then you have the possibility of regeneration. But what is the requirement of this plasticity? To combine stability with a constant enlargement. Because at every point that you change something and grow and enlarge, you're changing. And you may change even some of the root pillars that hold the collective together. If you change too much, then the system breaks down or it splits because some oppose that change because the pillars may represent some truth and they split to lose the value of the collective. And yet, you have to keep changing. If you don't change, because the world is changing, the universe is growing, God is growing, if you don't change to keep up with that evolutionary movement, you become obsolete, you decay, and you die out. So can you combine this stability with constant enlargement or new application of the power of the soul idea or life idea in its being? Only then can you sustain this collective. Now I'm going to extend this or apply this to the context of a collective such as the Sri Aurobindo Ashram or Auroville or numerous other collectives like the Sri Aurobindo Society or Sri Aurobindo's Action or World Union, which the mother initiated, representing specific aspects of a work which needed to be done or for which there was an opportunity. And if you see the development of these collectives or subgroups, we find often that in the people who held the container of the seed idea that was implanted, either insufficient strength or insufficient plasticity or insufficient vitality to make this regeneration. We are, of course, still too close to these movements, but we can see already this particular movement, which the mother named World Union, which was meant to disseminate Sri Aurobindo's idea of world unification on a spiritual foundation. It lost steam when its two great founders passed away, and there was not sufficient force to sustain. And yet, the truth behind it is as if struggling to regenerate and reformulate itself. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo's action was meant to be a special focus for introducing Sri Aurobindo's thought in the political space and particularly in India. And again, you can see the collective weakened and is struggling now to find its relevance. It may regenerate itself, or it may weaken. But the fact that the mother put a force behind it, it is likely to regenerate if it can, we use the modern term, reinvent itself. That is what Sri Aurobindo uses a more general language when he says constant enlargement. There has to be some element of a new form which has to keep coming and growing to keep it relevant. We do see in a more stable form of society such as Auroville or the Sri Aurobindo Ashram, where there's a sitting collective on a spot and not only an institution, there the same problem, the need for constant enlargement and a restating or reforming of the truth which the mother planted as its seed and its purpose. When the mother was describing the Matrimandir, she spoke of the outer skin of the Matrimandir, first in a general way, and then she said, it was as if she was seeing the future. At some point, this skin might have to be replaced to keep up with the change. What it meant, we have yet to see. Perhaps that change has already taken place, or perhaps there is still something to come. We don't know, because the skin itself went through many kinds of transitional phase. But generally describing the institutional structure within Auroville, she said she was not giving fixed forms because the forms had to evolve with the evolution of the people. The same thing in the ashram, when you see how the mother gave a list of do's and don'ts. She said there are guidelines, and she gave the very basic minimum rules without which it wouldn't be an ashram. And after that, she said for the rest, she did not give strict rules precisely because human nature tends to want to break the rule for the very fact that it exists. And so she allowed that plasticity in an institution which was as if a container for this awakening to the spiritual life, allowing plasticity for individual needs as well as holding the collective at the same time. And it's a difficult challenge. Increasingly, as the mother withdrew from the active governance of the community, you see the tendency for ossification, rigidification, uniformity which are imposed now, and the suppleness and plasticity fades out rapidly until it leads to a crisis. And at that point we may say that, or let me map it first before going to that. The first stage would be the birth of the collective, which we can say in the ashram at least started around 1920, when Sri Aurobindo had a large, increasing number of disciples around him. formal establishment of the ashram community from 1926, and then the growth phase. Numbers grow, buildings have to be taken up, activities are instituted. Depending on numbers and their needs, certain formulations are made. And once that initial growth phase stabilizes sufficiently, there is the youth, where there is a great hope, great idealism which continues. The first great shock came with Sri Aurobindo leaving his body. For many who had come to the ashram, it was a point of shock where they said, but we came because we thought we will become immortal. We are here for a supramental transformation and we will be immortal. And Sri Aurobindo left his body. And of course that led to a kind of an introspection, and we can say a phase of ripeness begins from there, and the small but forceful character of the youth perhaps changes. But from the point the mother began to withdraw, there was a marked tendency of decline, and she herself commented on it. She said just one day that she did not go to the playground, there was a huge quarrel and clash between different groups and interests. And she said, if in one day you can do this, what happens when I withdraw much more? And so the declining phase, of course, is not very rapid. It takes a much longer time because there's a strong spiritual force, and the elements, the people who make up the community, for a large part had grown under direct influence of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And as those numbers dropped, you see a more obvious form of the decline. What is necessary now? There is, of course, this great soul idea, which we have to assume is sufficiently powerful, large, and force-giving. But on the other side is the receptivity of the people, which needs to be strong, vital, plastic in mind and temperament. And you will see these three things. Even if one fails, there is a tendency for the breakdown. Fortunately, in the span of human time, we have a short human lifespan compared to the work which has to be done, and there is a constant regeneration. New beings enter the collective and grow. And if they can bring sufficiently the strong, vital, and plasticity in mind and temperament to combine stability with constant enlargement and new application of the power of the soul idea, we will see a regeneration. And he is applying this description to the context of the Indian civilization, as of course other civilizations. Here he says, it can go through many cycles before final exhaustion. Moreover, the idea is itself only the principle of soul manifestation of the communal being, and each communal soul again a manifestation and vehicle of the greater eternal spirit that expresses itself in time and on earth, is seeking, as it were, its own fullness in humanity through the vicissitudes of the human cycles. And he gives you the big picture. There is right on top this eternal spirit that expresses itself in time, on earth, through all these movements. And this greater eternal spirit puts out soul manifestations of the communal being. And each of these can put out special seed ideas or soul ideas, life ideas, which are put out from there. And these may exhaust themselves, and other life ideas fill and grow. And this we can see in Auroville, for example, where certain life ideas which earlier were necessary in that first phase of birth and growth, after a while lost relevance. Other life ideas filled in and took over as they were relevant for the phase of youth or ripeness. But the soul idea behind presides, and behind it this greater eternal spirit. Particularly in these two communities, the aspect of the greater eternal spirit is very strong. And whatever form one may give to the soul idea behind, that is infusing in it all the strength necessary and the inspiration. And it is only left to the human beings now to be able to adapt and give new forms. A people then, which learns to live consciously, not solely in its physical and outer life, not even only in that and the power of the life idea or soul idea, but in the soul and spirit behind, may not at all exhaust itself, may not end by disappearance or dissolution. So if we are able to live, not by the physical, not by the vital, not by the life idea, but go back to the soul and therefore live by the soul values, the spirit behind, then you do not need to exhaust. And this is because both these communities are primarily spiritual communities, this is possible. And I will even say necessary for the future of humanity. But we see other communities in the world which have gone through similar phase, many famous ones, and they have as if exhausted something of their relevance. They are no more the force that they used to be. One such is the Theosophical Society. When it first burst upon Europe, it had such a powerful impact. It even defined so many of the spiritual and collective streams in Europe and the United States. So many movements burst out of it. But what we see about 50 years down, it's as if it had exhausted its initial burst. And even in the initial phase, when it was very openly in relation to the spiritual beings which were guiding it, that seems to have faded out, and there is no more that obvious relationship. And yet it works behind the scenes. It is quietly still spreading, doing its work, but no more with that dramatic aspect. And perhaps it may regenerate itself if that soul idea and the receptive base in humanity can live up to this requirement. I have recently had occasion to meet somebody who was fourth generation in the collective and at a senior level in the administration. And it was interesting to see how the spirituality that it established and the values it brought are still living in the people and are still held in the family. And that gives you an indication of what is possible in the regeneration or reformulation. But this is possible to all spiritual collectives if or as long as they live by the soul and the spirit behind. And even if at any time, I'm skipping some sentences, and even if at any time it appears to be on the point of absolute exhaustion and dissolution, it may recover by the force of the Spirit and begin another and perhaps a more glorious cycle. And this is the interesting insight. Even if it appears to have exhausted itself, the regeneration from the spiritual source can even create a far greater cycle in the awakening. And so we should not be deceived by the appearances of what may appear to be an exhausted collective or a collective in some internal confusion or crisis. And I took this up to highlight the importance of this collective body, which he describes like an individual with a soul, with a mind, and with a body. And if this is true of civilizations and cultures which have obviously a physical basis, it is equally true of religions. And as I mentioned earlier, even of science, which is a form of religion. There's the religion of science, a teaching, a body of knowledge and tradition, and people representing it. Behind it is a soul idea. And as long as the soul impulse is strong, the body of science continues to renew itself, replacing its people. And it is a commonly accepted fact in the development of science that science undergoes a paradigm shift when the people that represent the old paradigm die. It's interesting that, like a religion, it builds people who are now the authorities. They are now your intercessors between the great truth and the form of the truth and the teaching of science. Very similar to the religion, except you've replaced God by truth or natural truth. And if Newton said that this is so, it must be so, because he is the great interpreter or the great priest, high priest of the truth. Until Einstein replaces him, displaces him. Even today, Einstein is still held as one of the great priests. And if you write a paper which questions or doubts any of Einstein's conclusions, it will not even be accepted for publication. But eventually, the people who represent that die and something emerges. I recently saw a study of the papers in science. In these papers, there's a tendency for new ideas to come. Eventually, somebody comes up who is as if an authority in that field, and you find all the papers eventually surround him and stay within the domain of his work. The moment he dies, there's a sudden burst of new papers which have ideas which so far were not as if permitted, or which are new, which break new ground and open new space in the field of science, which go beyond this person and his authority, and a new development takes place. And this is a study done of the studies of various papers. And they were wondering in the study, is it because there is this authority figure that prevents new papers from coming or new ideas which are innovative? Or is it that the very fact that he's alive, others will not allow? And they couldn't come to a clear conclusion of what it was. But you see this pattern very clearly in religions equally. And science as a religion reflects only that pattern. So I'm pointing to this body of religion, is the phrase Sri Aurobindo uses, that there is actually a force behind, a soul behind, and with its own mind and with its own body, and with its own will, a force with which it reaches out to fulfill itself, and depending on the character of the religion or that particular inspiration, it will have its own objectives for which it will use people. It's something which I want to touch upon before we proceed, that the force is conscious of its purpose and can use people as instruments. The force senses when there is a person who could be a good instrument, it reaches out to catch the person and can grip the mind of the person. It was in the context of the Catholicism that the mother made this observation that the ritual of baptism has an occult power through which the force behind the Catholic Church is able to grip the person, and the grip is so strong it will not let go for the rest of your life. And it's something to be thought about, that many of these rituals have an occult component which is used by the force to hold and then control and extend itself, its domination. And every now and then there are two great religious tendency, let's say formulations, which collide. And it is the forces which are colliding and playing out their collision through the conflict in people, even sometimes leading to wars, conquests, and so on. The body of religion is not merely a poetic idea, it is a real fact that he is describing. And I'll share a personal experience I had with two traditions. In one, I was reading a newspaper article of a lady who spoke of how she had converted to this religion, a strong one, and she said, after conversion now I feel I belong and I feel safe. And I said, what is this feeling that you feel safe when you convert to a religion? And she had left her own birth religion. And as I was thinking about it, I was leaning to feel that sensation in that quality of the religion. And as I was leaning into it, I was in a perhaps half drowsy state. It entered into a contact with the energy of the religion, and suddenly it was as if the power reached out to grab and hold the mind, and instinctively the mind pulled back. It was literally the experience of an energy that was conscious, and it had sensed someone and wanted to grip. And that gave me a bit of a shock. The second experience I had was with a different religion, It was a group nearby where I had gone and met with the priest who was also a teacher for the school, and he had invited me. I had spoken there, and I found the man to be extremely warm and affectionate, even embracing in his affection. And there was some connection which took place. Then, within 2 days, I think, at night, I had a dream in which I saw that man with his robe and a priestly attire walk in. Next to him, 2 other priests with swinging lamps of incense walking in, and with a great force. And in the dream, I had the clear sense, it was a dream experience, I was half conscious that I was in that state. There was a clear sense that the power behind the religion was reaching out to own me. And as I watched, the person came and his mouth came and settled on my shoulder as if to plug in or feed on the energy. And at that point I called out the mother and I woke up. In both these cases, what I experienced was the energy behind the religion. It does not necessarily mean the spiritual origin of the religion, but the energy of the organized religion with the machinery that it has created and the force of its need to control, to possess, to dominate and expand itself. Both these are religions which have inbuilt the idea that they have to go out and conquer and convert everybody. It is not so for all other religions. You will not find this for religions where there is no proselytization or such idea. But the idea behind this is the body of a religion is actually a being. And when there is this attempt to cut out a truth sharply, to cut out of distortion and error sharply, you may also lose a truth which damages the body of the religion. We would want each of these religious movements or tendencies to grow in a manner which is healthy, that they can nourish the human spirit and assist in the spiritualization. So having discussed this sufficiently, we move on to the next part of the discussion. And again, I want to draw upon a passage from Sri Aurobindo's The Foundations of Indian Culture, where he describes the passage through which a collective has to pass through in its development. Any society, he says, passes through 3 stages. The first is a condition in which the forms and activities of the communal existence are those of the spontaneous play of the powers and principles of its life. All its growth, all its formations, customs, institutions are then a natural organic development, expressing but without deliberate intention the communal psychology, temperament, vital and physical need. So this initial phase is one in which the driver is a kind of a vital intuition. You sense something, there is a need, there is a requirement, and it takes on a form, organizes a form. The second stage of the society is that in which the communal mind becomes more and more intellectually self-conscious. First in its more cultured minds, then more generally in all the parts of its life. So here, the mind of the collective is taking charge. What was earlier a vital intuition, a life impulse, and a need and a perception of that leading, now being replaced by the mind and the intellect of the collective, which becomes conscious. And so with it, it learns to review and deal with its own life, communal ideas, needs, institutions, in the light of the developed intelligence, and finally by the power of the critical and constructive reason. He describes the strengths and limitations of each of these phases. But you'll see this. Let me take another example of a company that starts as a startup. As a startup, you have something you want to create, and every time you meet a problem or a challenge, you create things around elements of the culture of the collective, institutional structures to deal with that problem. Once it has grown sufficiently, now the numbers are too big. Now we find we are wasteful. And that's when the second phase comes. The intellect kicks in and says, all right, since we have so many people doing this, so many people doing that, we need a separate department, separate policy to manage how we hire people, how we fire people. And the whole intellectual structure begins to impose itself. What was earlier a very plastic, living, friendly atmosphere of the collective is replaced by formality. And often when this transition takes place, a lot of the initial founders get upset because they want that for informality and they leave, replaced by more structured, corporate, intellectualized systems. And the same, he says, applies for societies. And we can say the same applies for religions equally. The problem of this reason is that it creates something too mechanical, which flattens out the individuality and the creativity. And it is in that phase also that these startups lose their creative edge. And then they have to eat up another startup. A new startup has brought a new idea which may threaten your dominance, so you buy it out. You absorb the team, absorb the idea, and enlarge yourself by absorption of another. It's a kind of very similar to how an animal eats another animal to absorb its life energy. But this is happening at the level of a collective. It does not have any more the creativity, it absorbs others to eat up their creative elements, their creative team or their idea that they represent, until it grows large enough now, maybe too large, too unwieldy, and begins to lose its relevance. A good example would be Microsoft. When it was a small, agile group, it was so effective, it was growing so rapidly, it pushed away this giant which was IBM, that was like a dinosaur. And this little agile creature comes in and replaces IBM, overturns its dominance in the field of software. But subsequently, when Microsoft itself became too big, too institutional, it lost its creativity and it survived by eating up and destroying other creative centers. So it has had to already go through two phases of renewal. One around mid-90s when Bill Gates literally destroyed software written, replacing it with something which integrated with the internet. The second phase after Bill Gates withdrew and the next person, I forget his name, anyway, it's an Indian who took over, and he has again reinvented as if the company, but still the machinery is too rigid, too fixed. So the third stage of evolution he describes, where it is only by reaching a third stage of evolution of the collective social as of the individual human being that the ideals first seized and cherished by the thought of man can discover their own real source and character and their true means and conditions of effectuation. And what is that? That will be when man in the collectivity begins to live more deeply and to govern his collective life, neither primarily by the needs, instincts, intuitions welling up out of the vital self, nor secondarily by the constructions of the reasoning mind, but first and foremost, and always, by the power of unity, sympathy, spontaneous liberty, supple and living order of his discovered greater self and spirit, in which the individual and communal existence have their law of freedom, perfection, and oneness. And this is the turn to the spiritual, of which the vital intuition was a reflection, of which the mental formation was a format. And of this he says, that is a rule that has not yet anywhere found its right conditions for even beginning its effort. And he's describing societies, civilizations, cultures. For it can only come when man's attempt to reach and abide by the law of the spiritual existence is no longer an exceptional aim for individuals, or else degraded in its more general aspiration to the form of a popular religion. So, what is required for this phase to come in? And this is the necessity for humanity today, or for any collective such as ours at the ashram or Auroville or numerous other collectives which aim at a spiritual awakening. We went through that phase of the vital intuition and the mental organizations even in these collectives. But the requirement here is this man's attempt to reach and abide by the law of the spiritual existence is no longer an exceptional aim. It's not that a few people are doing it, or when it hits the collectivity, it degrades into a religious format. None of these are acceptable. It has to go beyond that. But is recognized and followed out as the imperative need of his being and its true and right attainment, the necessity of the next step in the evolution of the race. That's the requirement, that it should not fall back into some religious form, nor a few individuals, but the larger collective recognizes this need for the spiritual awakening. And that, he says, has not yet happened anywhere. But certainly in collectives such as ours, where the primary object was spiritual and where the primary attraction for people to join the collective was the spiritual aspiration, this can begin to happen at least. And this should be our effort. I read this out because you will see this 3-step pattern in the development of religions. And this is what he will now elaborate on. In the very next paragraph, which we are now reading, he describes that vital intuitional phase. Subsequently, in the next paragraph, he describes the mental and life development increasing and what happens then. And then, of course, if it falls short, you have the problems, but if it can correct with the spiritual completion, then the religious form has fulfilled its purpose. So with this background, you can see how Sri Aurobindo writes across various different texts, describing within their context truths which are essentially universal and eternal. And if you have not read them all, you miss the elaboration of certain ideas. The idea is here. The next paragraph uses this phrase, even the vital intuition, and the next one uses the phrase of the intellect. But the fact of these 3 phases, which is described there, we can see how it corresponds here. It will be equally true of the other 3 lines of development of occultism, spiritual philosophy, and inner quest, inner seeking of the experience. There will be these 3 phases. Even in our own spontaneous spiritual experience, there is the phase where we feel and there is an intuition which leads. And then after that, the mind steps in and says, yes, now I must formalize and organize this body of my experience. But that tends to then mechanize. And there has to be the final full awakening of the spiritual. So we'll read now the next paragraph. Evolutionary nature, in her first awakening of man to a rudimentary spiritual consciousness, must begin with a vague sense of the infinite and the invisible surrounding the physical being, a sense of the limitation and impotence of human mind and will, and of something greater than himself concealed in the world, of potencies, beneficent or maleficent, which determine the results of his action. A power that is behind the physical world he lives in and has perhaps created it and him. Or powers that inform and rule her movements while they themselves perhaps are ruled by the greater unknown that is beyond them. That's a long sentence describing all the different facets through which this awakening begins. First with that which is most general, and then growing towards that which is the most deep or most high. potentially. But still it is an initial opening. A vague sense of the infinite, capital I, and the invisible, capital I, surrounding the physical being. You go on top of a mountain and you look out and you're overwhelmed by this sense of the vast space around. And it feels something so great, so wonderful, that you cannot but recognize there is a special presence here. And it's always at the top of the mountain. Notice in all the traditions, in all the cultures of the world, there is a sacred mountain and the gods lived on top of the mountain. Why is that? Because as you go up, you open out to the wideness, the sense of the infinite. And automatically with that, the perception of something deeper, something invisible. Or it can be from the ground, you look up and you have this majestic Mount Fuji. And it is so beautiful and so large, and it dominates the entire landscape with such a presence that you cannot but recognize that it is a conscious presence. And when you feel that, you feel a reverence spontaneously towards it. And if you're more intuitive, you may even have a perception of the quality of consciousness that it has. Because when you go to another great mountain, you feel a completely different quality. And very often, the names that are given to the mountains are representing the quality that has been perceived by that culture. You see, for example, a volcano. Go to the Hawaiian region or in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, they have an active volcano. And suddenly it bursts out. It's roaring. And it's so similar to the sense of a roaring beast, like a conscious being now roaring, and then it goes back to sleep. It becomes dormant. And then again it wakes up and it's furious and goes back to sleep. And you have an obvious sense that it is a conscious being who's waking up. It is unhappy, or it is happy, or it is angry. And you would want to appease it, or propitiate, or ask its favors. Please give us the rich nutrition we need for the soil, for our plants to grow, or please do not destroy our crop. There has to be a relationship which emerges spontaneously from this perception. So first, a vague sense of the infinite and invisible surrounding the physical being. You're more in a physical consciousness. And a sense of the limitation and impotence of human mind and will. And with it, of something greater than himself concealed in the world. You can do all you want, but if the volcano bursts, all your efforts are lost. If there is an earthquake, everything breaks up. Something much more powerful can override all our best efforts. And so obviously you want to enter in relation with that. Or you give to it a value, positive or negative. And so that comes to the third facet of potencies, capital P. Potencies meaning conscious powers, not just mechanical powers. Potencies beneficent or maleficent, which determine the results of his action. You may make all the effort you want, but the outcome can be broken by a storm. When did the storm come? Why did it come exactly when we were doing this? We created all the best arrangements for a great feast, and the rains came and everything was spoiled. You have the crops which are about to ripen, and it's only a question of 5 more days, and suddenly the rains come and the entire crop is lost. And yet, just a few kilometers down, there's a village where none of the crops were touched by the rain. Only our crops. What do you recognize? That there's something out there which chose to bless them, but not us. And obviously you start thinking, what did we do wrong? Or the power is beneficent or maleficent. A power that is behind the physical world he lives in and has perhaps created it and him. So now the power grows larger, because everything you see could be created by this. If you're in a small island, then the volcano is your dominant deity, because the island itself is created by the volcano. And you may even feel that the nourishment that you gain through the plants is from the soil enriched by the volcanic flows. So it is the mother, it is the source of all the life in this space. If you go to the northern parts of India, it is the Ganga which spreads the waters, which gives life to the plains. And so she is the mother coming from on high, and naturally she becomes a symbol of life-giving source at a very material level. But if you have a deeper intuition, you also see that she is a conscious being, and there's a whole story behind how she comes. She was invoked, she was called, she was not there before. So there's in the race a memory of a time when she was not there, and then she was invoked, and now she is here. And so you rejoice in her presence and build that relationship. Or powers that inform, they fill in inside the form and work through the form, inform and rule her movements, while they themselves perhaps are ruled by the greater unknown that is beyond them. You will see this in the later Upanishadic texts, the idea that the gods are running things in the universe, but they themselves have a wrong notion that it is their strength, it is their greatness by which they have done their work. And then there is the higher power, unknown, capital U, which comes, which says, it's not you, it is this greater being's victory that is your victory. And the sense that the gods themselves are insufficient, or there is something greater behind which is unknown or unknowable. And why should there be these two statuses? Because when the human turns towards this vague sense of a presence, potency, it can only relate to it first in some form that is close enough to be recognized. If the form of the potency is so large that it is as big as the universe, well, you can never meet it. If the ant meets the elephant, it can only recognize a grey wall. It cannot recognize elephant, which is too big. So you have to reduce that to a level that is recognizable. And that's what you're able to catch first. Obviously, that's a reduction. Behind that is that greater thing which you're unable to know. So necessarily there are these two levels which will form in that first contact, until your consciousness becomes mature enough now to be able to meet that which is beyond the form and beyond these limitations of your perception. So you'll see in this one sentence, Sri Aurobindo captures the full sweep of perceptions of the spiritual behind the appearance of the physical. There are no others. Try to find one more and you'll find it is a subset of one of these. It's interesting how completely he captures the full spectrum of experiences. So, now Sri Aurobindo is describing that phase of human development. He had to determine what they are and find means of communication so that he might propitiate them or call them to his aid. So now our fields have to wait 5 more days for the full ripening, and the rains are beginning to gather, the clouds are gathering. What do? Please, clouds, stop. That's what you will do spontaneously. Even if you don't accept that the clouds have conscious beings, you'll just say, please, don't come now, wait for a few more days. If you have a deeper intuition, you will perceive the presence in the cloud, or which presides over the working of the clouds, and you will address that presence. If you have a deeper knowledge, you will find or create a relationship with that presence and say, look, you want to reign, we will give you another space. You reign there, but don't come here now. Or we want you to wait 3 days, so for 3 days that we want you to wait, we will do this. What it is that would drive away the clouds, perhaps a fire. Or the rainwater which has accumulated in the pond, through that water you reach out to the clouds and make an offering there to the water gods. Whatever the form might be. And you find, you experiment, you attempt to make a relationship. Propitiate them or call them to his aid. Now we need to water our fields. We have not had enough rain. Can you call them? If you could stop them, you can equally call them. He sought also for means by which he could find out and control the springs of the hidden movements of nature. At this point, the intuition is working, and you recognize that every time that the clouds come, there are these insects which emerge from the ground. And you can feel intuitively the two are connected. If we can use this as a means, because they are as if symbols or representations of the clouds, if we can use these as the means, then we can influence the cloud, because it's the same force that is working in both. So in some traditions, it's the beetle, a particular beetle that is associated with rain and lightning. In the Americas, I will have shared this example of somebody called Rolling Thunder, who was a medicine man, and he demonstrated to the author of the book who documents it that he takes this beetle, flips it over, and with a feather tickles the belly of the beetle. And each time the feather touches the belly, there's a sharp lightning in the sky. And it's almost as if you take two wires and you touch them and there's a spark, except the spark is up there and the wires are here. There's a link between the two. In many spaces, I believe in Indonesia or Thailand, the link is made through the frogs. Because whenever the feeling, the mood of the rain comes, the smell of the rain comes, the frogs are out. So they are the link point, they are the mud. They live in the mud, in the water, they enjoy, and they are the link point. If you propitiate the frogs, you will get good rains. Now, to a person who sees it very superficially, you will say, oh, this is all superstition. But to the intuitive sight, we see the link, we know the link, and now we can activate the link. And when demonstrated in this dramatic way, that actually making the offering to the frog or tickling the belly of the beetle, you are affecting things in the sky immediately, instantly. Of course, the reasoning mind is shocked because it goes beyond its capacity to understand. And that's how you will see the very next phase that Sri Aurobindo will describe. The second line of development is occultism. Even as Sri Aurobindo describes the unfolding of religion, the elements of occultism are already present. So he had to determine what they are and find means of communication so that he may propitiate them or call them to his aid. He sought also for means by which he could find out and control the springs of the hidden movements of nature. So here you've got this link. Can we now replace both of these by something even more essential? The key, which is of course in the energy, in the link, in the consciousness itself, and you do not need those physical forms. I have my feather, and I could replace the beetle by something in which I invoke that energy, which links, and I tickle or trigger that energy. So you've as if got to the core behind from which the power of, that's where the occult knowledge would act. This he could not do at once by his reason, because his reason could at first deal only with physical facts. So the intellect is there, but it is too fixed in the physical consciousness. But this was the domain of the invisible and needed a supra-physical vision and knowledge. He had to do it by an extension of the faculty of intuition and instinct which was already there in the animal. You saw the dog knows before you what's going to happen with the weather or with the earthquake. And why can't I know? You see, this phase which he is describing, it may appear as if it's a very primitive phase, many thousands or perhaps even a few million years ago. But Sri Aurobindo wouldn't waste an entire paragraph going in detail in all these little steps if it was not of relevance to us today. So it has two levels of relevance. You will see how this description applies to current science. Current science is actually this intellect fixated on the physical facts. It senses things beyond, it thinks it is able to catch those springs of nature's working by scientific means, by technology, and master them. But every now and then it hits a boundary where its knowledge or its current understanding fails, and there's something beyond for which it needs this supra-physical vision and knowledge by an extension of the faculty of intuition. Who are the great scientists who make the breakthroughs in science? What characterizes them? You say, oh, they are geniuses. What is the nature of genius? Precisely intuition. Intuition which cuts through the clutter of confusing facts and goes to the heart of it and catches the core and is able to articulate it. What made Einstein great was this power of cutting through appearances. There's a very interesting description of Richard Feynman. He is also another extraordinary physicist. Einstein was much more a mathematician than a physicist. Feynman was more a physicist, also a mathematician. So Feynman goes with this wonderful idea he has. If I approach it in this way, I will be able to unify all the forces of nature in my theory or in the mathematical formulation of the theory. So Einstein is sitting there, goes up to him and says, here's my approach. Isn't it a brilliant idea? He's convinced this is going to lead something because the intuition is seeing the truth behind and senses it. It's very close. All it needs is how I rearrange my formulation of maths and symbols. He describes it to Einstein. And he documents this in his book. He says, Einstein nods and thinks for a while. And then he says, it's a very interesting approach, but it's going to be very difficult. And Feynman goes back and starts doing his mathematics, and he spends years over it. Every now and then he seems to come close, but something doesn't fit, something doesn't work out. And he came to the conclusion finally, Einstein was right. But then his question was, and he raises this in the book, how could that man know within a few seconds what took me years to validate? What was that power which he had? And it's not by chance that many of these were also musicians. It is an interesting description of Einstein when he was given a problem. He would go through and discuss, and then he would say, I will now think a little. It was his German accent. And he would get up and walk, pacing back and forth in deep thought. And he would come back with an insight and work it out. What was he doing at that time? What was that power? And it was not trying out 100 different approaches of mathematics. It was putting himself into a certain state. It was almost meditative, where suddenly something is touched, an intuition flashes, an insight caught, and now worked out subsequently through the maths. So the character of genius is precisely this power of intuition. Needed a supra-physical vision and knowledge, which he had to do by extension of the faculty of intuition. So you have the supra-physical vision or knowledge, you are able to see, yes, this is going to work out, no, this is going to be difficult. It's supra-physical, it's going well beyond, even beyond the mind's, even the higher mind's perspective to an intuitive glimpse. And so what he is describing here may represent a certain phase of human development, but that phase is equally valid today in all of our current development. Not only in the development of science, which matches this phase very clearly, it also matches our individual life growth. When a person first turns to the spiritual possibilities, or starts with a rejection of the spiritual and a very materialistic orientation, he says, I don't believe in all that. And yet he senses something. I've met people, I won't recall now specific ones, but several people who speak of how they need to go into the mountains and spend a few weeks all alone trekking. What happens when they're trekking for a few weeks all alone? First, they're all alone. What happens to your consciousness then? Automatically it begins to interiorize because you are no more interacting with others on a superficial level. Second, it goes to the high mountains. Why? Because that's where you have this opening to the infinite and the invisible. The sense of the deeper truth, reality is much more closely felt. So there's a meditation taking place in an interiorized state. And then he's trekking for hours every day. What happens when you do that? Automatically there's a level of exhaustion in the body that is first built up, which kicks the whole consciousness one level up to draw life force from the universe, what you call second breath. And suddenly you feel so light, so clear-headed, so full of energy. And you're in a state of some kind of exaltation, as if you're fasting, that kind of feeling comes up. And everything becomes so much more clear, and those deeper things are felt close. And that's the spiritual experience, the closest that they're able to get to by the only means available to that very material way of thinking which refuses all other higher ideas and yet needs to enter in relation to the reality on a deeper level in this way. A spiritual experience, even, or the beginning of a deeper spiritual experience. And for such a person, this phase is still valid. You're perceiving the infinite, the invisible, and you're beginning to relate to it. And perhaps at that point, the person has a life problem and he says, I ask the mountains, help me, give me the knowledge, give me the insight, give me the strength. You may use the vocabulary of the mountains because your consciousness is fixated on the physical form, but you're reaching out to that presence for the deeper knowledge. It's equally true in the developmental phase of an individual as he emerges out of a very physical life with the first workings of the intellect, which is much more sensory based. And at that point again you go through a similar phase. You need that deeper intuition to understand what you're perceiving, what you're sensing. You will find inevitably all children in early teenage have unusual experiences with the supernatural or unusual fears, and they're trying to make sense of it. And this captures something of that phase. And we see that faculty of intuition and instinct already there in the animal. This faculty, prolonged in the thinking being and mentalized, must have been more sensitive and active in early man. So Sri Aurobindo is placing it as if it might have been, it must have been, but obviously it's coming from not only a logic but a deeper insight. If you read Sri Aurobindo's diary notes in the Record of Yoga, there's a very interesting passage where he describes a series of visions of various stages of human development, where exactly the same pattern is repeated. If I remember right, it is a barbarian on horseback who catches a woman who comes from a more refined culture and seizes her and takes her to be his wife. And he's seeing in that an attempt of nature to bridge strength and subtlety or refinement, to create a new grade of humanity. And this same pattern of vision he sees at various stages of human development, how the same pattern is repeated each time, now unifying these two disparate tendencies and building a higher grade and a higher grade. So if you actually use the vocabulary, you will use terms like a mentalized vital man, but it's still vital man. And then there will be a mental man who comes as a grade within it, before mentalized physical man who comes as a grade, before the proper mind emerges. So there may be many attempts where the vital mixes with the physical, the mind drops in a little bit, and then again it rises one step, again the vital mixes with the physical now with a stronger power, and the mind fills in a little more and a little more until the full power of the mind is organized and the vital and the physical part is less powerful and the mind can take full charge. But repeating the pattern multiple times. And all these are, of course, visions in which he saw the whole journey of historical development. So what he is describing here is not only logical, but also validated in his own direct perception. So if, he says, this intuition and instinct has emerged in the thinking human, it must have been there even before the thought and stronger at that point, because not so clouded by the power of reason. So, though still mostly on a lower scale, for he had to rely on it largely for all his first necessary discoveries. He had to rely also on the aid of subliminal experience, for the subliminal too must have been more active, more ready to upsurge in him, more capable of formulating its phenomena on the surface, before he learnt to depend completely on his intellect and senses. So there is an inferior working of this intuition, which is largely the vital intuition, and with it a subliminal experience. Now the subliminal experience may be not so much the intuition, but something felt as if behind the scenes, you don't know how to describe it. You enter a space and you feel uncomfortable. You enter another space and you feel warm and welcomed. You have no other way to describe except to say something is strange here. And I don't feel happy, I don't feel comfortable, I don't feel safe. You move away. You walk into a forest clearing and suddenly you feel as if you're being watched. And either in that feeling you feel you're not welcomed, or you feel you have trespassed into a sacred space that you're not worthy to enter, and so you withdraw. How do you explain it? What is that thing watching? What is this thing sacred? What's happening? I have no idea, but I feel it, and that's all you can say. And these are the experiences which you begin then to formulate and give some reference to in the culture. Oh, that is not a space for everybody. Only the most pure are allowed to go there. Why? Oh, otherwise you might be punished. You give to it a form because that's what you felt over there going. You felt something didn't want you and it was more powerful than you. You withdrew. But maybe it has nothing to do with punishment, but that's how you might translate it. And it forms so many stories around different places, sacred sites, not so sacred, and sometimes even dark spaces. The intuitions that he thus received by contact with nature, his mind systematized and so created the early forms of religion. One of the most obvious common features in all religions will be the relationship with the sun and the sunrise. Every morning, as there is a sunrise, you can feel the energy is rising. Even before the first light appears in the sky, you can feel in the animals the stirring that's taking place. And if you're sensitive in the vital intuition, you feel in the trees that they're waking up. And the sap of the trees begins to rise up. And of course, it can take various practical forms. You want to take the most nourishing quality of this plant, you pluck at dawn. But if you pluck after the sun rises and the sunlight falls on the plants, it dries up those essential oils, the sap which has just risen, and it dries up the most fine part of the sap. So if you want the finest part of the sap, just before sunrise is the time that you have to pluck and eat. It's obvious, rationalized, it's obvious. But you feel it, you sense it, and now you formulate it. And then depending on what you want, if you want the denser part of the sap, you will pluck after noon, when the finer part has been evaporated, which you don't want. And all these different organization of knowledge, which is then transmitted in the culture. The rising of the sun has a still deeper meaning. It is the dawn of light, of knowledge. And so the sun becomes representative of knowledge. And obviously, opening to the sun when it is rising, when it is most accessible to you, is your way of opening to that quality of sattva, refinement, clarity, consciousness. So the best time for you to receive that would be as the sun rises, because within you the same light dawns and the quality of refinement grows. After that it becomes too intense, you cannot bear it, you have to withdraw into the shade. And equally when the sun sets, that's another point of transition. The day has ended, the night not yet begun. The point where the two join, in Sanskrit, sandhya, is extremely valuable. It's as if the gap between two worlds, the world of waking, the world of night, where the powers reverse their play. In the daytime, the gods are more powerful and the beings of darkness hide. In the night time, the beings of darkness come out and play. The gods are as if asleep. In between is the transition point where you can slip between them. Neither of them can rule over you. You can get through and access some deeper insights and possibilities. Get to the highest, beyond them even. And so certain rituals are to be done at that moment of sandhya, where you can reach the most powerful or the most high influence and call its invocation. Once that time is past, you've missed the opportunity. And so, in many ways, all this which is dismissed today as superstition emerges from a deeper insight and has a deeper I'm tempted to use the word scientific basis, but we will say an occult scientific basis because it's an occult science. So they create the early forms of religion. This active and ready power of intuition also gave him the sense of supra-physical forces behind the physical, and his instinct and a certain subliminal or supernormal experience of supra-physical beings with whom he could somehow communicate turned him towards the discovery of effective and canalizing means for a dynamic utilization of this knowledge. So were created magic and the other early forms of occultism. It's interesting that these two tendencies are very close. The early forms of religion and the early forms of occultism and magic are very close. If you go to the core religion, the core rituals of any religion, you will find they have an occult foundation. An occult foundation which may be used for a spiritual cause, but nevertheless the foundation is occult. That principle can be used for anything. Offering incense, lighting a flame, doing a repetition of a mantra, doing an invocation, repeating 3 times. Why 3? You'll find this is universal. And all of these have a deeper occult principle and come from this insight. So, the full sentence and the full sense of it we will take up next Sunday. But what he said here is this power of intuition gives you the sense of the supraphysical force, and the instinct of the subliminal experience gives you the ability to communicate and now organize this knowledge and put it into practice for your benefit. Now we'll take a few examples like this of how the knowledge is formulated, why repeating 3 times, why lighting incense or a flame, and so on. And we'll take some of these as examples, and you will understand also the spiritual symbol in the religion as well as the occult principle, which is useful for the religion, but also practiced in other objectives of an occult intervention. And they are common base of knowledge, and often you will find they are common across traditions at their core level. And then there are variations which are specific to each tradition. And then from here he takes it to the next outcome, that you realize that within you also there is something which survives, not only inside nature but within you. So this sequence is interesting. Sri Aurobindo is telling you that first you perceive outside and then inside. Because first your senses are turned out and then only they are ready to turn in. So what follows subsequently with the inner awakening, all that will be part of the rest of the paragraph to be kept for next Sunday. We can take a few seconds to concentrate on what we have read and the suggestions it has for our own practical life, collectively in the community as well as our individual growth.